Montana Territory, late spring of 1878. The wind was sharp with pine and snowmelt when Victor Zane spotted the broken wagon off the main trail. Its back wheel cracked clean through, and one side leaning into a muddy ditch. A child's cry carried just faintly through the trees. Victor dismounted quietly, boots landing in soft, damp earth. He tied his horse to a low branch, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, not drawn, not yet. He moved slow, eyes scanning. The wagon was splintered at the axle, canvas torn from a storm, and there, huddled beneath what was left of the canopy, were two girls. They looked no older than 10 and 6. The younger one, with hair like wheat and dirt smudged across her cheek, was holding a doll missing one arm. The older girl stood in front of her like a shield, eyes sharp for someone who had clearly been crying. Victor holstered the pistol. "I am not here to hurt you," he said, voice low and calm. "Name's Victor Zane, you two all right?" The older girl didn't move. "Why should we trust you?" He crouched down to her level, not touching his hat. "Because I got eyes and a heart, and both are telling me you should not be out here alone." The little one sniffled. "Mama told us to stay. She went looking for help. That was yesterday." Victor's jaw tightened. "All right," he said after a moment. "I am taking you somewhere warm. You can ride my horse. We will find your mother." The older girl hesitated, then nodded once. "I am Viola. This is my sister Violet. Viola and Violet," he repeated gently. "Pretty names." He lifted Violet first, tucking her into the saddle, then helped Viola climb on behind her. She held on tight to her sister, still watching Victor like she was waiting for him to prove her wrong. He walked the horse, leading them down the trail toward his cabin 2 miles east, heart heavy with thoughts of their mother. A woman out there alone in the wild could vanish like smoke in the wind. By the time they reached his place, the sun was low, casting long gold light over the trees. His cabin was small but sturdy, built by his hands and kept precise. He got the girls inside, wrapped in warm quilts, and started a fire. "You hungry?" he asked. Violet nodded, wide-eyed. Victor pulled out leftover stew, warmed it, and served them both. He watched as they ate, quiet and fast. Something in his chest ached. That night, he laid out a bedroll by the fire for himself and gave the girls his own bed. He stayed up late, listening to the wind and the wolves in the far-off hills, thinking about their mother, what she must be going through if she was still alive. At dawn, he saddled up again. "You stay here," he told Viola, crouching by the hearth. "I will find her." She looked at him, eyes still wary but softer than before. "You promise?" He nodded. "With everything I have." He rode west, retracing the trail. By mid-morning, he found boot tracks heading into the trees, deep and hurried. He followed them over a ridge and down into a stream bed, and that was where he found her. She had collapsed beside the water, her dress soaked and torn, one arm scraped up from a fall. Her face was pale, lips cracked, but she was breathing. Victor slid down the bank. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then her lips moved. "My girls. They are safe," he said quickly. "Back at my home. I am here to bring you to them." Tears welled before she could stop them. He took off his coat, wrapped it around her, and lifted her carefully into his arms. She was light, too light, and her fingers clung to his shirt like she still thought she might lose everything. He rode slow on the way back, holding her steady in front of him, her head resting weakly against his chest. Her name, she told him, was Vivienne Bell. When they reached the cabin, the door flew open before he even stopped the horse. Viola and Violet ran out barefoot, crying out, "Mama," in voices that cracked. Victor helped Vivienne down, and the girls wrapped their arms around her, sobbing into her skirt. Vivienne knelt, trembling, clutching them both tight. Victor turned away, giving them the moment, but his throat burned with something deep and warm. Later, after the girls were asleep, Vivienne sat at the table wrapped in a blanket, her hair damp from a wash in her hands, holding a mug of warm tea. "You saved us," she said. "I just did what was right," Victor said. "No," she said, looking at him. "You could have passed us by. You did not." He looked at her then, really looked. She had strong cheekbones, a mouth made for smiling though it had not seen much use lately, and eyes that had seen too much. But they were steady on him. "You are safe now," he said. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the mug down. "I do not know what comes next for us. My husband died last winter, no family back east who would take us. We were headed for Bozeman, hoping for work, but the storm took the wagon. I walked all day thinking I could find someone. You did, he said. You found me. There was silence for a long beat, warm and full. Then very softly she smiled, not forced, not polite, but real. Victor felt it like a sunrise in his chest. You should rest, he said, standing. You and the girls stay here until we figure out a plan. She stood too, slower. Thank you, she said again. He nodded and turned to stoke the fire behind him. Her voice came quiet but sure. Victor, he looked over his shoulder. I do not know how to repay you. You do not owe me anything, she stepped closer. I would still like to. Her eyes searched his, soft and strong. He did not move. Then stay a while, she nodded. And for the first time in a long, long time, they both felt like maybe home was not a place, it was a person. The rain came 2 days later, soft and steady through the pines, soaking the earth and muting the world to a hush. Victor stepped out onto the porch to check the sky, his coat already damp at the shoulders. The girls were inside, perched at the table with scraps of paper and charcoal pencils he'd dug out from an old storage box, drawing quietly while Vivienne kneaded dough at the counter, sleeves rolled above her elbows. He watched her through the open doorway for a moment before stepping back inside, brushing his hat along the doorframe to shed the water. You handle storms better than most, he said, nodding toward the bread. She didn't look up. Living through enough of them teaches you how to keep your hands busy. Victor leaned against the wall near the stove, the heat rising gentle against his side. There's a family down by Trail Creek. Bakers, German folks. Might take to your bread if you're looking to trade for supplies. Vivienne's brow furrowed as she shaped the dough into a curved tin. I've never sold anything I've cooked. You bake like someone who could. She paused, glancing up. You think so? I know so. She held his gaze a moment, then turned back to her work. I was a seamstress before. Victor shifted his weight, arms crossed loosely. Back east, St. Joseph, Missouri. My husband had a smithy there. When he passed, there wasn't much reason to stay. Rent was high. Work was thin. I sold my shears to buy the wagon. He said nothing to that. There wasn't anything to say that didn't sound like pity, and he knew she'd had her fill of that from other men. The girls began humming, off-key and soft, some old tune that didn't quite match between them. Vivienne glanced toward them, her expression gentling. They've slept through the night since we came here, she said quietly, more to herself than to Victor. He didn't answer right away. He watched the girls, Violet making wide, looping circles on her paper while Viola shaded hers with careful, even strokes. They were safe. That was enough for now. I've got a shed out back, he said after a moment. Roof leaks, but it's dry in most places, could patch it up easy. Be a good place to set up a sewing table if you wanted. Vivienne's hands slowed. That offer meant for a few days, or longer. Victor met her eyes. Long as you need. She held his gaze again. This time it lingered. By supper, the rain had thickened, tapping across the roof like fingers. The girls curled by the fire after eating, heads drooping over their drawings. Victor carried them one by one to the bed, tucking the quilts around them as Vivienne watched from the doorway. When he stepped back into the main room, she hadn't moved. Her hair was damp at the ends, pulled into a loose braid over her shoulder. She looked at him like she could see the weight he carried, the kind that didn't show in his shoulders but lived behind his eyes. I keep waiting to feel like I've landed somewhere, she said. I don't know if I have. You don't have to know yet. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, soft and low. I used to believe that love was something you settled into, she said after a pause. But now, I think maybe it's something you choose, every day. Even when it's hard. Victor looked at her, the light from the fire catching in her eyes. That sounds right. She stepped closer, the hem of her dress brushing the floorboards. I don't know what this is, Victor. I just know that when I hear your voice, it feels like something calms inside me. His voice was quiet. That's what I feel too. She reached out then, fingers brushing his hand, not tentative, just honest. He turned his palm up, lacing their fingers together. Neither of them spoke again that night. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full of something steady and sure, like the land outside, quiet, wide, and waiting to be built on. By the time the last snow patch melted from the shadowed slopes, The shed behind Victor's cabin had a new roof, and a table built up from 2 wagon planks he'd salvaged. Vivienne opened the doors each morning after the girls had eaten, tying her apron and setting to work with the care of someone who'd once made beauty from little and now had even less. Victor took to rising earlier, hauling water and cutting wood before the sun crested the ridge. He never lingered near the shed, but he passed by often, pausing just long enough to see the curve of her shoulders bent over fabric or to hear the rustle of shears cutting through muslin. And she'd glance up sometimes, just briefly, as if she knew he was there even when he didn't speak. One afternoon, as he returned from checking the fence line, he found Viola sitting on the porch with a needle and thread, squinting at a patch of torn flannel. "She teaching you," Viola nodded, pulling the thread through with slow precision. "Mama says if I can mend, I'll never need as much." He crouched beside her, watching her fingers. "You've got her steadiness." She looked up. "You always come back when you say you will." "I aim to," she notices. He didn't ask who she meant. That night, after the girls had gone to sleep and the fire was low, Vivienne stepped outside, pulling her shawl tighter against the late chill. Victor was seated on the porch rail, whittling a bit of pine into something shapeless. "I heard from the Ridgeleys," she said, standing beside him. "They want shirts and aprons. Said if I can send a few pieces down next week, they'll pay in flour and salt pork." He looked over. "That's a fine start. I didn't think I'd be useful out here. You've got more worth than most who were born to this land." She sat beside him, careful with her weight on the worn boards. "I keep wondering if I'm building something that can last. Or if I'm just passing time until we have to move again." Victor set the carving aside. "You don't have to go anywhere. And if I stayed..." Her voice was steady but quiet. "What would we be?" He turned to her, the porch light catching the lines of her face, lines that hadn't been there in her youth but had been carved by survival, not age. "We'd be what we choose," he said, "day by day. Breath by breath." She studied him, then leaned back against the post, her shoulder brushing his lightly. "I used to believe I'd only ever be someone's burden." "You're not mine, I know," she said. "That's why I can breathe here." Neither spoke after that. The pine trees whispered overhead, and somewhere down in the valley, a nightbird called once and then was silent. The next morning, Victor saddled the wagon and hitched his mare. Vivienne stood beside him, holding a bundled stack of finished garments wrapped in a flour sack. "I can take them down," he offered. She tightened the twine with a firm knot. "I want to go, you sure?" She nodded. "The girls can stay with Mrs. Denton. She offered yesterday." Victor helped her into the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her. The trail was rough in places, but she didn't flinch when the wheels jostled. She kept her gaze forward, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Half a mile from the Ridgeley homestead, she turned to him. "Do you think folks see it, that we're not just neighbors?" He kept his eyes on the road, but his voice was even. "They might. But it doesn't matter how long it takes them to understand. We know what we are." She looked out over the hills, where the wildflowers were just beginning to show in the hollows. "I'd like to build something steady," she said. "Not just a life, a home, a place that feels like more than shelter." He nodded, fingers tightening slightly on the reins. "You already started." She glanced at him with something quiet and full in her expression. "So did you." When they reached the Ridgeleys, she climbed down on her own, shoulders straight, like she'd always belonged among mountain roads and barter deals. Victor waited by the wagon, watching her speak with the Ridgeley matron, her voice low and sure. On the way back, she didn't speak much. The sun was warm on her hands, and she rested one on the edge of the wagon bench, fingers brushing his knuckles. She didn't pull away. Back at the cabin, the girls came running, arms full of wild daisies they'd picked from the pasture edge. Vivienne bent to receive them, pressing a kiss to each brow without hesitation. Then she stood again, turning to Victor. "We'll need to plant soon," she said, brushing a leaf from her skirt. "Late spring's moving fast." He nodded. "I've got seed potatoes in the root cellar. We can start with those." She smiled, not wide, not uncertain, just enough. He remembered that smile, the first one he'd seen from her. And standing there, with the girls laughing behind her and sunlight catching the edge of her hair, he understood something simple and unshakable. What they were building wasn't temporary. It was already home. The first frost came early that autumn, threading silver through the grass before the sun crested the hills. Victor stepped out with a lantern still lit, breath rising in clouds as he crossed to the barn. The mare's flank was warm under his hand, her ears flicking as he checked the feed. Inside the cabin, Vivienne had risen before the girls, her shawl wrapped close as she stirred oats over the fire. She glanced over her shoulder when he came in, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "You'll need your heavier coat today," she said. The winds turned. He hung the lantern by the door. "I'll bring it down from the loft after breakfast." She nodded, then added, "There's a man coming from Gallatin Fork this afternoon. He wants to talk about ordering new curtains for the storefront in town." I told him I'd meet him here. Victor filled a tin cup from the kettle. "You want me to be around for it? I'd like that, if you could." He gave a quiet nod and leaned against the hearth, letting the steam rise into his face. The girls stirred in the sleeping loft above, Violet's voice muffled with morning sleep. Vivienne didn't speak again until the oats were ready, and the girls had come down, still yawning, to their bowls. She moved with practiced quiet, laying out bread beside the porridge. Victor watched her hands, steady even now. Later, he climbed into the loft for the coat. The corner trunk held more than just winter things. He lifted out a folded parcel of muslin, stitched through with a border he didn't recognize. Holding it up, he saw it was a half-finished quilt square, the pattern unfamiliar. When he brought it down, Vivienne looked at it without smiling. "It was my mother's," she said. "She started it before she passed. I found it in the wagon, tucked with a few of her things I'd forgotten I'd packed. You plan to finish it," her eyes settled on the cloth. "I was thinking maybe Viola could, when she's ready." He folded it carefully. "That's a good thing to pass down." She didn't answer right away, just took it from his hands and smoothed it flat across the table. The man from Gallatin Fork arrived after midday, his buggy drawn by a gelding with a limp and his hat pulled too low. He smelled of starch and travel, but his manner was polite. Victor kept to the porch while Vivienne met him at the table, her ledger open and her pencil sharp. Victor listened to them speak through the open door, the man asking about fabric types and edge stitching. Vivienne's answers were clear, her tone clipped but not cold. When the man tried to barter lower, she didn't flinch. "That's my rate," she said. "If you want cheaper, there's someone in Helena who might sew without hems." The man shifted but said nothing more. When he left, he tipped his hat to Victor, who nodded once. Vivienne came out with her arms crossed. "He'll send measurements next week." Victor looked out toward the trees. "You held your ground. I don't have time to be anything but direct." They stood quiet for a while, the wind catching the edge of her skirt. "He said you were lucky," she added after a moment, "to have me here." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Did he?" I told him it wasn't luck. It was choice. His gaze stayed on her face, noting the way her jaw stayed lifted. "You think about staying?" he asked. "For good?" She looked down the slope toward the pasture, where the girls were gathering wind-fallen apples into a basket. "I think about what it would mean to stop moving," she said. "To put roots in the ground where there's room to grow. I think about what it would mean for them to have something solid." Victor shifted his weight. "You'd be welcome. You already are." She didn't look at him, but her voice softened. "I'd need more than welcome." He stepped closer. "What do you need?" Her eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "I need to know this is a place we can all belong, not just be sheltered, not just survive." Victor didn't reach for her. He didn't have to. "You belong here," he said. "Not because I say so, because you've made it so." She took a slow breath, her hands loosening at her sides. "I've never built something with another person," she said. "Not like this. Neither have I." The wind moved past them again, but she didn't shiver. "I won't be someone you carry," she said. "I don't want you light," he answered. "I want you real." Her eyes softened and her hand found his. The girls called from the ridge, their laughter floating down like something woven from sunlight and wind. Vivienne didn't let go. "We'll plant winter greens next week," she said. "I'll mark the rows," he replied. And just like that, the future settled between them, quiet, certain, and in motion. The first snow held off longer than expected that year, letting the ground stay pliant through late November. Victor had spent the past several days clearing out the edge of the north field where windfall branches had piled high. When he came back in near dusk, his coat carried the scent of sawdust and cold bark. Vivienne was at the table, fitting 2 lengths of deep blue calico along a chalked pattern. Her eyes flicked up. "There's a dance in town next week," she said before he'd hung his coat. "The community hall's finished. Hiram Denton's been helping raise it all summer. They're opening it with music and pies." Victor rubbed his hands near the stove. "You want to go? I'd like to see what it feels like to be among people again. With you," he turned toward her. "You'll have to teach me the steps." She smiled, but it was different from the ones he'd seen before, not guarded, not cautious. It was the kind that made something shift inside him, like the last weight sliding off a pack after a long trail. That night, after the girls had gone to sleep in the loft, she stood at the hearth brushing out her hair with slow strokes. Victor sat nearby, mending a split in his boot sole. "I never had a wedding dress," she said, not looking at him. "We were married at the courthouse. He gave me a brooch, not a ring. I wore a gray skirt that day." Victor set the boot aside. "You thinking about that now? I'm thinking about what it means to begin again. Not from nothing, but from something real this time." He rose, crossed to her. "Then wear whatever you want to that dance. Doesn't have to be white, doesn't have to be anything but yours." She looked up. "Would you stand beside me if I did?" "I already do." The dance came after a week of heavy frost. The girls stayed with the Ridgeleys, who'd grown fond of them and insisted they'd be fussed over properly. Vivienne wore a dress she'd sewn in quiet hours, rust-colored with a high collar and a hem that moved like water when she walked. Victor wore his best shirt, stiff from storage, and a wool vest she'd repaired without telling him. The hall was still rough around the edges, unpainted rafters overhead, lanterns strung from hooks, but the music was lively, and the floor held couples who hadn't danced in years. Vivienne stood beside Victor at the wall for a while, watching. He didn't speak, just waited. When she finally turned to him, her hand found his and he followed her onto the floor. They moved slowly at first, careful, but she guided him with a light touch at his shoulder. He found the rhythm, not because the music told him the steps, but because she did. Her eyes never left his. Between songs, they stood near the stove at the back of the hall, sharing a mug of cider. She leaned into his side, her fingers brushing the inside of his wrist. "You ever think you'd have this again?" she asked. "I didn't know what to call it until now." She tilted her head. "And what do you call it?" He looked down at her, the light catching the curve of her cheek. "Ours." They stayed until the last fiddle note faded. On the ride home, the stars were sharp above them, the way they only got in cold air. She rested her head against his shoulder under the blanket, and he drove the wagon slow, not wanting the night to end too soon. Winter settled in earnest after that. Snow came in clean layers, and the cabin stayed warm through the efforts of 2 sets of practiced hands. Vivienne's orders grew: steady curtains for the mercantile, aprons for the schoolhouse cook, even a christening gown for a woman in town. She stitched by lantern light, often with Violet curled up nearby, humming under her breath. Victor added a stone chimney to the side of the cabin, replacing the old iron stove. He built a shelf for Vivienne's sewing box, carved with a simple vine pattern she'd once said reminded her of Missouri honeysuckle. They didn't speak of what came next. They lived it. One morning in late February, Victor came in from the barn with pale straw tangled in his shirt and a grin he couldn't quite hide. "You'll want to come see," he said. Vivienne pulled on her shawl and followed him out, boots crunching over packed snow. Inside the stall, nestled in a bed of hay, was a newborn calf, still damp but already trying to rise. "I found her just before dawn," he said. "Didn't think she'd come this early." Vivienne crouched beside the calf, brushing a hand gently over its neck. "She's strong, she is." When she stood, he didn't move away. "I've been thinking," he said. "We've built a good thing here. We've done it slow, done it right." She watched him, quiet. "I've got a ring," he added. "It's plain. But I worked it myself from iron and silver. You asking? I'm saying I'd like to spend what's left of my days beside you, however many were given." She took his hand. "Then put it on me." He did. They're in the barn, with the calf breathing soft behind them and the cold air curling around their joined hands. In spring, they wed beneath the same pine where he'd first tied his horse the day he found her girls alone. Viola carried a small bouquet of early wildflowers. Violet stood between them, holding Victor's hand and Vivienne's, and beamed like the earth had finally gotten everything right. They didn't invite many, just those who mattered. Victor built a new table after that, long enough to seat guests when they came. Vivienne hung curtains she stitched by hand, patterned in soft greens. The girls each had their own corner of the world now: Viola with her quilt pieces laid out in careful rows, Violet with her books and her plant clippings pressed in paper. In the evenings, Victor read aloud by the hearth, his voice low and steady. Vivienne sewed, and sometimes she just watched him, her eyes peaceful in a way they'd never been before. And in that quiet cabin nestled at the edge of Montana's endless green, with the seasons turning sure as breath, they built something that held, not just a life, a home, forever.